The air inside Professor Edwin Meyer's library was thick with the smell of old paper and polished wood, a scent that instantly transported anyone who entered into another era. Hannah had always been intrigued by places like this, where every shelf seemed to hold a story, a secret, something only the professor himself could reveal. As she closed the door behind her, muffling the quiet hum of the campus beyond, she felt a curious sense of anticipation that she couldn't quite explain. Professor Meyer had been her advisor in her final semester, guiding her through the intricacies of her thesis with a patience and depth she hadn't expected. He was an accomplished historian, a figure of respect on campus, and yet there had always been something about his gaze, a certain intensity, that had sometimes made her lose her train of thought when he looked at her a moment too long. Now that she was no longer a student, the professor had invited her to visit his private library, offering her access to some rare texts he thought would be useful in her postgraduate research. She had readily accepted, her curiosity as much about the books as the man who collected them. The professor appeared in the doorway from the back room, looking slightly surprised, as though he hadn't expected her to arrive so promptly. His expression softened into a warm smile as he greeted her. "Punctual as always," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to echo gently in the quiet room. "Come in, make yourself comfortable." Hannah found herself acutely aware of her own movements as she walked further into the room. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with shelves, filled with volumes of all shapes and sizes, some so worn that their spines were barely legible. A heavy, wingback chair sat beside a reading table, both angled toward the light from a tall, narrow window that cast soft shadows across the room. She could sense the care the professor had put into this space. It was, unmistakably, a reflection of him. She set her bag down on the floor, taking in the room with quiet admiration. "This is incredible," she said, meeting his gaze. His eyes softened, and for a moment, she thought she saw something in them, a flicker of warmth that was quickly replaced by his usual composed demeanor. "I'm glad you think so," he replied, motioning to a nearby shelf. "I've gathered these over many years. Each one has a story, a journey. There's something reassuring, I think, in knowing that these books have witnessed history in their own way." She nodded, intrigued. "It must have taken a lifetime to collect them." "Indeed," he said, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "But then, I've always believed that knowledge is a journey without end." Hannah couldn't help but smile. He had said the same thing to her in one of their last meetings, and the words resonated with her now, in this private space, as they had before. She felt an unspoken bond between them, born from shared moments over the past year, those hours spent dissecting historical texts, debating theories, and exploring ideas late into the evening. She found herself watching him closely as he picked a book off the shelf, tracing its spine with his fingers. His hands, worn yet graceful, were mesmerizing. They told stories of their own, of years spent handling books, writing, teaching. There was a kind of elegance in his movements, in the way he handled each book, as though it were a treasure. She suddenly wondered if he treated people with the same care, the same attentiveness. So he said, holding the book out to her, "Shall we begin?" She reached out to take it, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was brief, almost imperceptible, yet it sent a jolt through her that she hadn't anticipated. She saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes too, a subtle widening that he quickly masked with a smile. "Thank you," she murmured, her heart racing slightly as she took the book from him. She moved to the wingback chair and sat down, opening the book on her lap, but she couldn't focus on the words. Her mind was preoccupied with the unexpected sensation of his touch. As she glanced up, she found him watching her, his gaze steady yet thoughtful. There was an intensity in his eyes, something that seemed to go beyond simple academic interest. It was a look she couldn't quite decipher, and yet it stirred something within her, an unfamiliar feeling that was both unsettling and strangely thrilling. "Is something the matter?" he asked, his voice gentle. She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "No, nothing," she replied, attempting a smile. "I was just thinking about how much work it must have taken to collect all of these." He nodded, his gaze never leaving her. "It has been a lifetime's pursuit, yes, But it's moments like these when I get to share it with someone who truly appreciates it that make it worthwhile. A warmth spread through her at his words. There was a sincerity in his tone, a quiet appreciation that felt oddly intimate. She found herself wondering what it would be like to know him outside of this room, outside of the context of professor and student. The thought was both exhilarating and forbidden, and she forced herself to look down at the book in her hands, as though it might offer some distraction from her thoughts. They spent the next hour in conversation discussing the texts, analyzing passages and exchanging thoughts on obscure historical events. Each time he moved closer to point something out, she felt her heart race, her awareness of him intensifying. His voice, low and measured, seemed to draw her in like a thread pulling her steadily closer. At one point, he leaned over her shoulder to show her a passage. His arm brushed against hers, and she felt a surge of warmth where his skin touched hers. She glanced up, their faces close, so close that she could feel his breath on her cheek. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in the charged silence that had settled between them. "I hope I'm not making you uncomfortable," he said softly, his gaze locked onto hers. "No," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Not at all." The intensity in his eyes deepened, and she thought she saw a trace of something he was holding back, something unspoken yet undeniably present. She felt her own defenses slipping, the line between curiosity and attraction blurring as they held each other's gaze. In that moment, she knew that whatever was unfolding between them was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The moment stretched on, neither of them breaking the gaze, as though each was waiting for the other to speak, to move, to somehow shift the delicate balance that had formed between them. Finally, Professor Meyer straightened, stepping back slightly as though he, too, had been caught off guard by the closeness. He cleared his throat, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes still held a trace of that earlier intensity. "Perhaps a break is in order," he suggested, gesturing toward a small cabinet in the corner. "Would you care for some tea?" Hannah nodded, grateful for the distraction, but also feeling a pang of disappointment at the interruption. Yes, that would be lovely. She watched as he moved toward the cabinet, his back turned as he prepared the tea, his shoulders slightly tense. She couldn't help but wonder if he was as aware of the tension between them as she was. Every glance, every brush of his hand seemed to carry an unspoken weight, a quiet intensity that was both thrilling and unnerving. He returned a few moments later with a tray holding 2 cups of tea and a small plate of biscuits. Setting it down on the table beside her, he handed her a cup, his fingers grazing hers as he did. She noticed the slight tremor in his hand and felt a flicker of something she couldn't name, a vulnerability in him, a crack in the composed facade he usually wore. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at him. He met her gaze, his eyes lingering on her a moment longer than necessary. "You're welcome." They sipped their tea in silence, the quiet between them filled with unspoken thoughts and half-formed desires. Hannah could feel her heart beating faster with each passing second, aware of his presence in a way she had never been with anyone before. It was as though the walls of the library, the books, and even time itself had faded away, leaving only the two of them in this charged, timeless space. Finally, she set her cup down, her fingers tracing the rim as she gathered her thoughts. "Professor Meyer." "Edwin," she corrected herself, the unfamiliarity of his first name on her lips somehow adding to the intimacy of the moment. "Thank you for inviting me here. This means a lot." He gave her a small, almost wistful smile. "It's my pleasure, Hannah." Well, it's rare to meet someone with your passion for history, for knowledge. I suppose I'm selfishly glad to share this with you." There was a warmth in his tone that made her feel both seen and understood. She felt a strange sense of belonging here, in his library, in his world. "You've done more for me than you know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment he looked as though he wanted to say something, but then he hesitated, his expression turning thoughtful. "And you've reminded me of why I started this journey. It's easy to forget, over the years, why we choose the paths we do." Hannah's gaze softened as she looked at him. She could sense the weight of years in his words, the subtle weariness that came from a lifetime dedicated to knowledge and solitude. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between them, but instead she settled for a small, reassuring smile. I think she began slowly that you've made more of an impact on others than you realize. His eyes met hers, and she thought she saw a flicker of emotion, something raw and unguarded. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual composed expression, but it was enough to remind her that beneath his reserved exterior, there was a man who felt deeply, a man who perhaps had his own share of regrets and longings. They continued their conversation, their words weaving around each other like threads, binding them closer with each exchange. She found herself drawn to his intellect, his quiet wit, the way he listened with such intent. Each moment seemed to bring them nearer, as though they were circling around something they both felt but could not name. As the afternoon wore on, the light from the window began to fade, casting long shadows across the room. The library took on a different feel in the dimming light, the corners growing darker, the air filled with a quiet intimacy that felt almost tangible. It was as though the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only this cocoon of shared understanding and unspoken attraction. At some point he rose to adjust a lamp on the desk, his hand brushing against her shoulder as he passed. The touch was brief, but it left her skin tingling, her heartbeat quickening in response. She glanced up, catching his gaze, and in that moment she saw the restraint in his eyes, the careful control he was trying so hard to maintain. "Edwin," she said softly, almost without thinking, her voice filled with a vulnerability she hadn't intended to reveal. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped. But then he took a step closer, his gaze intense, as though he were searching for something in her eyes. "Hannah, if I may be honest, this isn't quite what I expected when I invited you here." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering down to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "I find myself conflicted," he admitted, his voice a low murmur. "There's a line here, a line I'm not certain we should cross. And yet..." She felt a surge of something, hope perhaps, or maybe desire. It was difficult to tell in that moment, and yet she prompted, her voice barely a whisper. He took a slow, steadying breath, as though he were struggling to maintain control. "And yet, I find it increasingly difficult to ignore what I feel when I'm with you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Hannah's heart was pounding, her pulse racing as she took in his words, the quiet confession that seemed to echo her own unspoken thoughts. She wanted to reach out, to close the distance between them, but something held her back, a mixture of fear and anticipation, the knowledge that crossing this line would change everything. "Edwin," she began, her voice trembling. I feel the same." For a long moment they simply looked at each other, the weight of their emotions filling the space between them. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the silent struggle between what he felt and what he knew was right. And yet there was something else too, a quiet yearning that mirrored her own. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers, as though he were waiting for permission, waiting for some sign that this was what she wanted too. She felt her own hand move, her fingers brushing against his, and in that instant the fragile boundary between them seemed to dissolve. He stepped closer, his hand cupping her face, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek. The touch was soft, tentative, filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. She looked up at him, her breath hitching as she saw the emotion in his eyes, the longing he had been trying so hard to hide. "Hannah," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as though he feared that speaking too loudly would shatter the moment. His gaze dropped to her lips, and she felt a warmth spread through her, a desire that she could no longer deny. Without another word, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both gentle and electrifying. It was a tentative, searching kiss, as though he were afraid to lose himself completely, and yet there was a depth to it, a quiet passion that left her breathless. She felt herself leaning into him, her hands resting on his shoulders as she responded to his kiss, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. The world around them faded away, leaving only the warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips, the quiet intimacy of the moment. When they finally pulled apart, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of wonder, regret, and longing. I shouldn't have, he began, his voice thick with emotion. She shook her head, her fingers brushing against his cheek. No, Edwin, please, don't apologize. They stood in silence, their eyes locked, each searching for something in the other's gaze, something to reassure them that this was real, that they were not alone in their feelings. The quiet between them deepened, thick with words they didn't dare say. For a moment they were both still, wrapped in the silence, feeling the weight of what had just happened and the line they had crossed together. Professor Meyer's hand lingered on her cheek, his thumb tracing slow, gentle circles against her skin. The tenderness of his touch was startling, his usual reserved nature replaced by a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. She felt her heart race, her thoughts a blur as she took in the sight of him standing so close, his gaze softened by a look of unguarded emotion. Hannah, he said softly, almost as if he were testing her name on his lips, making it a part of the moment they were sharing. She felt a shiver run through her at the sound of it, the way he spoke her name as though it were something sacred. Edwin, she whispered back, her own voice filled with a tenderness she couldn't hold back. He let out a soft, almost resigned sigh, his forehead coming to rest against hers. I don't know how this happened, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I've spent my life avoiding connections, keeping my distance. But with you. Hannah closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his breath against her skin, the steady rhythm of his breathing mingling with her own. With me, she prompted, her heart racing as she waited for his response. With you, he continued, his voice barely more than a whisper, I feel. I don't know how to put it into words. It's as though something inside me has been awakened, something I didn't even know I was missing. The honesty in his words, the quiet vulnerability stirred something deep within her. She had always admired him, always respected him for his wisdom and his strength, but seeing this side of him, the side that was uncertain, that felt deeply, made her feel as though she were seeing the real Edwin Meyer for the first time. She reached up, her hand covering his as it rested on her cheek, and looked up into his eyes. I feel it too, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. From the moment I met you, I felt something I couldn't explain, something that only grew stronger every time we talked, every time we shared those moments in your office. He swallowed, his gaze never leaving hers. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it was nothing more than admiration, but I can't ignore it anymore, not after this. They stood there in silence, their breaths mingling, their fingers intertwined in a silent promise they hadn't yet spoken aloud. The weight of their emotions hung between them, filling the room with a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. Without another word, he leaned in, capturing her lips in another kiss, this one deeper, more urgent, as though he were pouring all of his unspoken feelings into that single moment. She felt herself melt into him, her hands slipping up to his shoulders, pulling him closer as she lost herself in the warmth of his embrace. The kiss grew more intense, their breaths coming faster, the restraint that had held them both back now crumbling away. She could feel his hands tracing the line of her jaw, his fingers threading through her hair, and she felt herself responding with a passion she hadn't known she possessed. Her fingers slipped beneath the collar of his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his heart beneath her touch. The sensation was intoxicating, and she found herself wanting more, needing to feel closer to him, to bridge the distance that had once seemed so insurmountable. He pulled her against him, his hands moving down her back, anchoring her in place as their kiss deepened, their breaths mingling in a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The world around them faded away, leaving only the two of them, bound together in a moment that felt timeless, infinite. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, he looked at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. His hand rested gently on her waist, his thumb tracing slow circles against her skin, and she felt a warmth spread through her at the touch, a warmth that seemed to reach all the way to her heart. Hannah, he whispered, his voice filled with a rawness that took her breath away. I don't want to stop, but I'm afraid of what this might mean. She looked up at him, her gaze steady despite the turmoil of emotions swirling within her. Edwin, I don't know where this is going or what it might mean, but I know that I want to be here with you. He closed his eyes for a moment, as though trying to absorb her words, to let them sink into the depths of his soul. When he opened them again, there was a softness, a quiet acceptance in his gaze that made her heart ache. "Then stay," he murmured, his hand moving up to cup her face. "Stay with me, just a little longer." She nodded, her heart racing as she allowed herself to be drawn into his embrace once more, the two of them entwined in a moment that felt both forbidden and inevitable. She felt his lips on hers, the warmth of his touch, the tenderness of his hands as they moved over her, exploring, discovering, as though he were learning her in a way that went beyond words. Time seemed to stand still as they stood together, the quiet intimacy of the library surrounding them, each touch, each kiss deepening the bond that had begun long before this moment, in the quiet exchanges, the lingering glances, the shared silences. As the evening wore on, they found themselves seated together on the old leather couch, his arm wrapped around her shoulders as she leaned into him, their fingers intertwined in a silent promise. They talked in whispers, sharing secrets, memories, and dreams, their voices soft, as though they feared to disturb the fragile spell that had settled over them. And when the time came to part, when the evening shadows had deepened and the quiet of the library seemed to echo their own reluctance to say goodbye, he looked at her with an expression she knew she would carry with her long after this night was over. "Hannah, I don't know what the future holds or what this means for us," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I know that I don't want this to end here." She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, her gaze steady as she replied, "Then let's not end it here." They shared one last lingering kiss, a silent promise of what was to come, of a journey they had only just begun. And as she stepped out of his library, her heart filled with a quiet, undeniable certainty that they had crossed a line that could never be undone. She knew that whatever lay ahead, it would be a path they would walk together, hand in hand, bound by the moments they had shared and the promise of more yet to come.